A heavy-set middle-aged man stepped onto a luxurious super yacht, ready to inspect its systems. Calm and focused, he carried a toolbox and a folder. But before he could go further, a sharply dressed white man stopped him, eyes filled with contempt. "Someone like you thinks he belongs here," the man snapped, loud and cold. Tension rose fast. The white man hurled insults about the mechanic's weight and skin color. A few guests turned to watch, some whispering, others avoiding eye contact. But no one, especially not the man yelling, knew the truth. The person he just humiliated might be the one who designed the very yacht he's standing on. Watch until the end to see who ends up asking for forgiveness. Marcus was a marine engineer, a man of few words and great talent. He had a strong presence, not just because of his heavy-set build, but because of the calm confidence he carried wherever he went. His large frame moved with purpose, slow but steady, and his dark eyes always held a quiet focus. People often underestimated him at first glance, but those who worked in the industry knew his name, and more importantly, his work. That morning, Marcus arrived at the harbor right on schedule. He had been assigned to inspect a newly delivered super yacht, part of a follow-up process arranged by the investment company that owned the vessel. It was a task he had done countless times, but he treated every inspection with the same care and attention. Wearing a clean but worn navy blue worksuit, he carried a toolbox in one hand and a leather folder in the other, filled with technical sheets and approval documents. As he walked down the pier, several staff members at the harbor noticed him. One man, wearing a reflective vest, gave him a respectful nod. Another called out, "Morning, Mr. Hayes," with a smile that seemed genuine. They weren't just greeting a technician, they were greeting the man behind many of the designs that had passed through the sport. Marcus replied with a small nod and a soft good morning, his voice low but kind. He never made a scene, never demanded attention. That wasn't who he was. When he reached the yacht, he paused briefly to glance at the vessel's exterior. Sleek, silver, and perfectly proportioned, it reflected the morning sun like a jewel on the water. Marcus had seen it many times before, from sketches to construction, but seeing it finished, afloat, still gave him a quiet sense of pride. Without a word, he stepped aboard, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the pristine deck. What he didn't know was that someone new was on board. Not a technician, not a crew member, but a guest. David, a man in his 40s with neatly slicked back blonde hair and a tailored white shirt, was hosting a private gathering with a few business associates. He was the kind of man who spoke loudly, laughed for show, and kept checking his reflection in his sunglasses. The moment David spotted Marcus, his entire expression shifted. His brows furrowed deeply, his lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. He lowered his drink and leaned slightly forward, as if not believing what he was seeing. His gaze moved from Marcus's stained work boots to the sweat on his brow, then to the roundness of his belly beneath the zipped jumpsuit. His judgment was written all over his face, sharp and unfiltered. David didn't speak yet, but his body language already screamed one thing: he didn't want this man here. David took 2 steps forward, planting himself directly in front of Marcus. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard and unwelcoming. With his arms folded and shoulders stiff, he stared at Marcus like an intruder. His voice came out loud and flat, carrying over the quiet hum of the yacht's engines. "What exactly are you doing here?" he demanded, emphasizing every word with suspicion. He didn't ask to understand, he asked to challenge. Marcus didn't flinch. He had faced worse. With a steady tone, he replied, "I'm scheduled to perform a systems check. I work with the design team." He reached into his folder and handed David a signed inspection clearance. His movements were slow, deliberate, respectful. His eyes didn't waver, though a hint of fatigue lingered behind them. David glanced at the paper, lips curled in distaste. He didn't even pretend to read it. He flicked his eyes from the document to Marcus's face, then down to his chest, his stomach, his boots. Finally, with a mocking smile, he handed the paper back. "Someone like you," he said slowly, "can't possibly understand the kind of tech this yacht runs on." His tone was quiet but sharp, and every guest within earshot could feel the tension rise. Marcus lowered the paper back into his folder, fingers tightening just slightly around the edge. His face remained neutral, but his eyes darkened. He took a slow breath, not to answer, but to steady himself. The insult hadn't been subtle, and it wasn't just about intelligence, it was about who he was, what he looked like. David wasn't done. Emboldened by the silence around him, he chuckled and added, "With that body of yours, I'm honestly surprised the dock's still standing." His voice was louder this time, performative, made for the people behind him. A few guests turned their heads. Some looked confused, others amused. One man stifled a laugh behind his hand. Another woman raised an eyebrow and whispered something to her friend. The air shifted, not with surprise, but with awkward familiarity. They had seen men like David before. And men like Marcus. One of the ship's crew, a young man in a white polo, took a step forward, his eyes flashing with discomfort. He looked ready to speak, but David raised a hand and waved him off sharply, like swatting a fly. The young man froze, glanced at Marcus, then quietly stepped back. Marcus looked around, his gaze calm but heavy. He had felt this heat before. The heat of being watched, judged, measured by appearance before a word was spoken. Still, his voice remained even, his dignity untouched. "I'm just here to do my job," he said plainly. "If you'd rather I come back later, I can." He didn't offer a smile, nor did he apologize. He just stood there, a man doing his work, holding far more strength than anyone cared to see. Marcus's words had been measured and respectful, but David wasn't done. As Marcus turned slightly, preparing to step back onto the dock, David took a sharp step forward and blocked his path again. His smile twisted into something cruel. He lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate, but loud enough to be heard by those standing nearby. "You're not walking away," David said, voice thick with condescension. "Not before I say what everyone else here is thinking." Marcus looked at him, quiet and steady. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. David leaned closer, his tone now colder, harsher. "I don't like someone like you," he said slowly, "touching anything that belongs to me." His eyes locked onto Marcus's, but they weren't challenging, they were hateful. "The hands, the body, the skin," he added, pausing between each word, "none of it fits here." For a moment, the air went still. Then Marcus spoke. His voice didn't rise, but there was steel beneath it. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said, evenly, clearly. That was the moment things shifted. Guests who had been sipping wine now turned to watch. Conversation stopped. The silence grew heavy, filled with tension that no one dared to break. David stepped back slightly, but only to raise his voice. "You heard him," he barked to the crew. "Get him off my boat." Two uniformed staff members hesitated, unsure. One of them, a younger man standing near the edge of the deck, suddenly froze. Recognition flashed across his face. He looked at Marcus with wide eyes, then took a hesitant step forward. "Wait," the young man started, but before he could speak further, Marcus turned his head slightly and raised his hand. A quiet, firm gesture. He didn't need saving. Not now. He gave David a final look, not angry, not afraid, just tired. Then, with quiet dignity, Marcus turned and began to walk back down the gangway. His boots echoed softly on the polished deck, the only sound in a crowd too stunned to speak. As Marcus stepped off the yacht, the crowd still watching in silence, a young man suddenly moved. "Jake," a junior marine engineer who had been standing near the railings, broke into a light jog to catch up. His face was flushed, not with embarrassment for himself, but for what he had just witnessed. "Sir," he called out, almost breathless, "wait. I'm so sorry about what just happened. That man had no right to speak to you like that." His voice shook slightly, but his eyes held sincerity. Marcus stopped and turned. His expression had softened, but there was still weariness behind his gaze. Before he could respond, Jake spoke again, words spilling out too fast to hold back. "You're Marcus Hayes, aren't you? I've read every article you've ever published. Your work on adaptive propulsion systems, genius. You're the reason I became an engineer." For the first time that morning, Marcus smiled. It wasn't wide or proud, just a quiet curl of his lips, enough to show he heard the words. "Sometimes," he said, "people only see what's on the outside. They miss everything that matters." Jake's admiration only deepened. "You designed that yacht, didn't you?" he asked, glancing back toward the vessel they had just left. Marcus nodded slowly. "Not just designed it," he said, his voice even. "I refined the entire system. Navigation, power, fuel optimization, all of it. That's my work." Jake blinked, stunned. His respect, already high, rose even further. He was standing next to the mind behind the most advanced vessel he had ever stepped foot on. "I had no idea," he whispered, "they should have introduced you properly." Marcus shrugged lightly. "It's fine," he said. "I don't need attention. But I'll be reporting this to the company. They deserve to know how their guests are behaving." Jake straightened his back, his voice firmer now. "Then I'll come with you. You shouldn't have to stand alone in that room. I saw everything." Marcus looked at him for a moment, his eyes more thoughtful than before. Then he gave a short nod. No thanks were needed. The gesture said enough. Back on the yacht, David wasted no time turning the tense moment into entertainment. With a glass of wine in hand, he walked among his guests, retelling what had just happened as if it were part of the evening's amusement. His voice was animated, his gestures exaggerated. "He just walked in like he belonged," David laughed, wobbling across the deck like he owned the place. It was honestly embarrassing. A few guests chuckled politely, but others exchanged uneasy glances. David continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "I don't care what paperwork he had," he said, "people like that don't belong on yachts like this. It's thuggish. Unprofessional. Totally inappropriate for this kind of setting." The mood began to shift. Some guests nodded, unsure of what to say, while others looked away. One woman, elegantly dressed and older than the rest, leaned toward her friend and whispered, "I think I've seen that man before. Wasn't he on the cover of Forbes last year?" Her voice was low, but her eyes were fixed on the dock where Marcus had disappeared. David overheard her but dismissed it with a loud scoff. "Please," he said, waving his hand, "don't fall for that. The guy's a dockhand with a folder and an attitude." He turned away before she could respond, already preparing his next exaggerated line. But across the deck, a tall man in a dark blazer had grown quiet. He pulled out his phone, opened a browser, and typed something in. The screen lit up with images, headlines, and awards. His eyes scanned the information. Then, suddenly, they stopped. There, in sharp resolution, was Marcus. Standing proudly on stage, holding an international award for innovation in marine engineering. The headline read, "Marcus Hayes receives Global Design Honor for Revolutionary Superyacht System." The guest's eyes widened. He glanced at David, who was still ranting, and then back at his phone. He didn't say a word. Instead, he quietly slipped the phone into his pocket and stepped away from the crowd. His expression had changed, less casual, more serious. Something important was coming. He looked like a man preparing to speak up. After leaving the dock, Marcus didn't go home. He went straight to the main office of the Yacht Development Group, the firm responsible for funding and managing the construction of the vessel. The building was sleek, modern, and quiet. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of salt and clean wood. He moved through them with quiet purpose, each step heavy with frustration he refused to show on his face. When he reached the top floor, he was welcomed by the director of engineering, Mr. Caldwell, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes. Marcus was someone Caldwell deeply respected, not just for his brilliance but for his integrity. When Marcus explained what had happened, every word, every insult, every look, Caldwell's expression tightened. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, then looked Marcus in the eye. "You should never have been treated that way," he said, voice low and firm. "Not by anyone, and certainly not while standing on something you helped create." Without hesitation, Caldwell called his assistant and gave a clear instruction. "Get the car ready. We're going back to the marina now." Jake, who had been waiting just outside the office, stepped forward. He had followed Marcus all the way to the building, refusing to leave his side. "I'll come too," he said quickly. "I saw everything. I'll speak up." Caldwell gave him a nod. "Good. We'll need every voice." When they arrived back at the yacht, the sun had risen higher, casting sharp reflections across the water. Guests were still on board, mingling in small groups, sipping drinks, unaware of what was about to unfold. But as soon as Marcus stepped back onto the deck, this time flanked by the company's top executive and a witness, heads turned. Conversation stopped. Some guests looked surprised. Others whispered to one another. Then David noticed them. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. His eyes locked on Marcus, then darted to Caldwell, trying to make sense of the sudden presence of authority. Caldwell didn't wait. He stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "I'd like everyone's attention," he said, pausing just long enough for silence to fall. Then he pointed toward Marcus, who stood quietly beside him. "This man is not a worker you can order around. He is not someone you push off a boat. He is the one who designed the very vessel you're standing on." The words hung in the air. Some guests looked stunned. Others lowered their eyes. And David, for the first time, had nothing to say. For a few long seconds after the announcement, silence held the deck. Then slowly, like a ripple through still water, people turned to look at Marcus. Some of them widened their eyes in disbelief. One woman near the railing clapped once, then again. Within moments, a few more joined her, and a soft wave of applause spread across the deck. David stood frozen. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked from Marcus to Caldwell, then back to Marcus again, trying to process what he had just heard. His eyes were wide, his brows furrowed in disbelief. It was as if the floor had shifted under him. Someone nearby whispered, "That's Marcus Hayes, the marine engineering genius." The words carried softly but clearly. People who had laughed earlier now looked at each other, suddenly unsure. A few began pulling out their phones, searching the name, realizing with shock just how wrong they had been. A staff member brought over a small microphone. Caldwell turned to Marcus and offered it without a word. Marcus accepted it with quiet hands. He stepped forward slightly. His face was calm, composed. There was no pride in his expression, only clarity. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. "This yacht was a challenge I took with pride. Every system you see, from the navigation to the fuel control, was part of a larger vision. Not for luxury, but for innovation. I built it to prove what was possible." He didn't mention what had happened earlier. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any rebuke. As soon as he finished, several guests stepped forward. One by one, they asked for a photo, a handshake, a moment of conversation. They looked at him with new eyes, not just as an engineer, but as someone who had earned deep respect. David remained where he was. His face had gone pale. He held his drink with both hands, but no one looked at him. He had become invisible in a space he once ruled. Jake moved beside him, leaning in just enough for only David to hear. "Next time," Jake said softly, "look a little closer at the person you're insulting." David didn't respond. His lips pressed together, his shoulders sinking as applause grew louder around him. After the applause faded and the crowd began to settle, David finally found the courage to move. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he walked toward Marcus. His posture was stiff, his steps unsure. The confidence he had carried earlier was gone. In its place was a man trying to recover what little dignity he had left. He stopped just a few feet away. His eyes shifted downward, then up, avoiding direct contact. With a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he let out a nervous breath and said, "I didn't know. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncomfortable. David's voice was lower now, nearly a whisper, as if he feared even his own apology. Marcus looked at him. His face was calm, not cold, but unreadable. He nodded once, then replied in a voice just loud enough for David to hear, "It's all right. Just, don't ever judge someone by how they look." There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet honesty. A truth David wasn't ready for earlier, but one he could no longer ignore. David's face turned red. His shoulders tensed. He nodded without speaking again and kept his eyes fixed on the ground. Behind them, Jake watched the moment unfold. He stood tall, arms crossed gently, and gave a small, approving nod. He didn't need to say anything. Marcus had already said enough. Around them, guests had begun to talk again, but this time the conversation had changed. They weren't laughing. They weren't speculating. They were reflecting. Some looked toward Marcus with newfound respect. Others glanced at David with quiet judgment. Marcus turned and began to walk away. His steps were steady, and though he said nothing more, the silence around him carried a weight that words couldn't match. As he moved through the crowd, people stepped aside for him. Some nodded, others simply watched, knowing they had witnessed something important. David remained behind. Alone. The man who had once controlled the room now stood on the margins, stripped of the spotlight, exposed not by Marcus's anger, but by his grace. The next morning, the headlines broke. A popular news outlet published a detailed article about the incident aboard the luxury yacht, including quotes from witnesses and confirmation from the yacht's engineering firm. The title was simple, but powerful: "Genius Engineer Insulted on His Own Creation." Within hours, the story had spread across social media. Thousands began reposting the article, expressing shock, anger, and overwhelming support for Marcus. People were moved not only by his achievements, but by the grace he showed in the face of such public humiliation. A hashtag began to trend, #Don'tJudgeByAppearance. It appeared across platforms, alongside photos of Marcus accepting awards, speaking at conferences, and standing proudly beside vessels he had helped bring to life. Then came the video. Someone on the yacht had recorded the exchange between David and Marcus. The clip showed everything: David's pointed insults, his mocking tone, and Marcus's composed response. It was short, but it didn't need to be long. The truth was clear. The backlash against David was swift and brutal. Within a day, he was forced to shut down all his social media accounts. His inbox was flooded with messages, most of them angry, some of them disappointed, a few telling him he had become a symbol of everything wrong with status and arrogance. The event planning company that had hired David for yacht consulting released a statement. They denounced his behavior and announced they had terminated all ties with him, effective immediately. While David retreated from the public eye, Marcus stepped into the light, on his own terms. He accepted an invitation to appear on a national morning show. Dressed simply, he spoke calmly and with deep clarity. "I've faced judgment my entire life," he said. "But I never let it stop me. Let your work speak. Let your ideas rise above your body, your face, your color. That's how we build things that last." His words echoed across the airwaves, through headlines, into classrooms and boardrooms. People didn't just hear him, they listened. During the interview, the host leaned in gently, asking Marcus about his journey. The cameras zoomed in, but Marcus didn't change his tone. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, not for drama, but with honesty that needed no embellishment. He began by recalling his childhood. As a boy, he had always been bigger than the other kids. His size made him a target. He was teased at school, mocked during gym class, left out of playground games. The names they called him still echoed in his memory, but they no longer held power. What they gave him instead was something deeper: resolve. "I used to come home and cry in my room," he said softly. "But I knew I had to find something they couldn't laugh at." That search led him to engineering. He had always loved the sea. The movement of waves, the sound of engines, the idea that something so vast could still be guided by human hands. He chose marine engineering not because it was easy, but because it was something few people dared to master. But even with his degrees, his talent, and his drive, doors didn't always open. "I got turned away," he said, "from interviews, from companies, from teams, because of how I looked." Sometimes no one said it outright, but he saw it in their eyes. The judgment came before the conversation even started. Still, he never stopped. He studied harder, worked longer, built better. He wasn't trying to prove himself to the world. He was proving something to the boy he once was. The boy who had sat in silence, holding in his hurt, dreaming of a future no one else believed in. "I don't want pity," Marcus said, his voice firmer now. "I don't need people to feel sorry for me. I just want what everyone deserves: respect." The host, a seasoned journalist who had interviewed hundreds, struggled to keep her composure. Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened. She reached for a tissue but said nothing, letting the moment speak for itself. That night, Marcus wasn't just a headline or a viral clip. He became a symbol. Not of success, but of endurance. Not of anger, but of dignity. His story wasn't about overcoming hate. It was about rising quietly, patiently, and powerfully above it. The days that followed brought more than applause. They brought change. One of the world's most prestigious yacht manufacturers reached out to Marcus with a proposal. They wanted him to lead an exclusive partnership, to design their next generation of super yachts. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation to shape the future of marine innovation. Marcus accepted the offer, not for the prestige, but for the opportunity to build without limits. A few weeks later, he traveled to France, where the company's design headquarters overlooked the Atlantic coast. The workspace was modern, filled with light and possibility. There, he was introduced to a team of young engineers, all eager to learn from the man whose story had inspired them. One by one, they approached him, resumes in hand, eyes full of hope. Many of them had followed his journey, not just for his technical skills, but for the way he carried himself through adversity. They wanted more than a job. They wanted to be part of something that meant something. Marcus welcomed them. But he also wanted to give more. Using part of his new contract earnings, he founded a scholarship. He called it Beyond the Surface, a program for mechanical engineering students who had faced bias, hardship, or exclusion. It was more than money. It was a message. Talent matters. and it deserves room to grow. Word of Marcus's success spread across campuses. One of the top American universities invited him to speak at their commencement ceremony. There, they surprised him by awarding an honorary doctorate in engineering. As the audience stood to applaud, Marcus simply bowed his head, humbled but not changed. He never let fame shape him. He turned down interviews that wanted drama. He rejected labels like visionary or genius. When asked how he wished to be introduced, Marcus always gave the same reply. "Just call me a mechanic," he would say, "who loves what he does." His story landed him on the cover of Time magazine's special issue on global changemakers. The photo showed Marcus standing beside a sleek vessel, arms folded, wind brushing against his face. But it was his smile that caught the world's attention. Quiet, grounded, and real. In a quiet living room somewhere across the country, a young boy stood in front of the television. He was heavy-set, shy, and used to being overlooked. But today, something changed. On the screen was a documentary about Marcus Hayes, showing clips of his speech, his work, and the respect he had earned. The boy's eyes lit up with wonder. He turned to his mother and said softly, "I want to be an engineer like him." His mother, caught off guard, looked down at her son. Tears welled in her eyes, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, with hope, with pride. She pulled him into her arms, held him close, and whispered, "You can be anything you want, baby. Just like him." At the same time, in a high-rise apartment overlooking the city, David sat alone. His glass was untouched, the lights dim. He stared at an open laptop, a familiar article glowing on the screen. It was the same headline he had mocked not long ago. But now, he read every word. Slowly. Silently. His face looked different. Softer. Tired. Regret lingered in his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The echo of Marcus's words returned to him, quiet but relentless. "Don't judge by appearances." It repeated in his mind, again and again. Meanwhile, the camera shifted. Somewhere along the coast, under a bright sky and open wind, Marcus stood at a shipyard. A new vessel was rising behind him, steel and vision coming together. He wore the same work jacket, sturdy and worn, and held a set of blueprints in his hand. His gaze was focused, steady. Around him, young engineers moved with energy and trust. On his left sleeve, stitched carefully into the fabric, was a small emblem. The words were clear and bold. "From respect, comes legacy." Marcus didn't turn to the camera. He didn't need to. His work, his presence, his story, spoke enough. Marcus never raised his voice. He never demanded recognition. He didn't need revenge or applause. Instead, he let his mind, his character, and his calm strength speak for him. This story was never just about a moment of insult or a man being underestimated. It was a reminder. A mirror. A quiet question for all of us. Do we see people for who they are, or only for what we assume? Today, David learned a lesson. But it's a lesson meant for more than just him. It is one we all must carry. Do not let your eyes limit someone else's potential. Do not let your judgment become someone else's pain. Respect is not something we give because of title, wealth, or looks. It is the basic language of every person who has chosen to grow up with grace. Sometimes, the greatest person in the room is the one you almost overlooked. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something real, share it. Let Marcus's story reach someone who needs it. Let it challenge a belief. Let it change a heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know how this story touched you. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you in the next story.